It was about a year ago when I first heard Amy's story. I read it, actually, and it has had a lasting impact on me. I'd like to share Amy's story with you. Amy tells of what it was like growing up with a mother who was schizophrenic. And she tells the story of when she was 15 years old. It was a very routine day, and her mother came to pick her up from school, to take her from school to a dentist appointment. And she said on the road to the dentist appointment, she began to sense that something was wrong with Mom. The mom was driving nervously like she didn't know where she was, and Amy began to fear that one of Mom's episodes was coming on. And so she asked, "Mom, did you take your medication today?" And Mom didn't give a very straightforward answer. And so Amy then knew that Mom was not only not stable, but she was not fully medicated. And so Amy did what many people do when facing the mental illness of a family member and feeling helpless to do anything about it. She pretended like everything was okay, like nothing was wrong. Well, at the dentist's office, Amy's name was called, and she went back to see the dentist. About 30 minutes after her dentist appointment, she came back out to the waiting room. But her mother didn't look at her. And just listen to Amy's words as she tells what happened next in that dentist office. "Mom, it's time to go. I'm finished." I received no response of any kind. Suddenly, I realized my instincts had been right. Something indeed was wrong with Mom again. And it was up to me to help her. I touched her arm gently, tried to shake her back to awareness with no results. She was rigidly catatonic, immovable, staring into space and clutching her purse in her lap with clenched fists in a waiting room full of strangers. After a couple of quiet attempts to rouse her, I began to attract attention. People stared at me as I tried to get her to respond. When she wouldn't move, I realized I needed to call my dad at work to come and help. As everyone in the room continued to stare, I walked to the reception desk and asked the woman behind the counter, who was also staring, if I could use her telephone. She said, "No, there's a payphone around the corner." When I explained that I needed to call Dad for help, I didn't have change for the phone, and it would be a local call, she still refused. So I went back to my mom and wrestled with her rigid arms, pulling them aside enough to get into her purse to find a quarter for the phone. I went back to the receptionist to ask if she could help keep an eye on my mom while I went out to use the payphone. She shrunk back in horror. "Is she dangerous?" After assuring the receptionist that my motionless mother was not about to attack her, I called my dad and then returned to sit next to my mom till he got there. The receptionist and the people in the waiting room took turns staring at my mom, staring at me, and looking at the floor. No one asked if I needed any help. Think about that. No one asked if I needed any help. Amy goes on to say, "In the years since, that incident has become for me a symbol. The way people in that waiting room responded to my family's public crisis is the way I've seen people, including those in the church, respond to serious mental illness. They didn't know what to do for my mom or anyone associated with her, so they did nothing." Now, I don't know what Amy's story or experience does for you, but I know for me, it was deeply convicting. I can still remember the time I first read her story and feeling that deep sense of conviction because God brought to my mind the times when people around me were suffering, and because I didn't understand or I felt awkward, I did nothing. And maybe my nothingness wasn't as heartless or as obvious as sitting and watching a 15-year-old girl struggle in a waiting room, but it was ignoring the problem all the same. I can think of times I've known people who were struggling with mental issues I didn't understand. And because I didn't understand them, because I didn't know what to do, I can think of times that I did nothing. I ignored the problem. I pretended like everything was just okay. And I think if we're all honest with ourselves, we could probably all also recall times in our lives, maybe a time or two, when we've probably done the same thing. Someone around us, a friend, a coworker, a family member, someone from church. But someone was suffering from a mental disorder or an illness. Maybe they were deeply depressed or even having a psychotic episode, or maybe they were having anxiety attacks. But we knew it, and we did nothing. We pretend like everything is okay. Maybe we just ignore the person, or we avoid the person. We just don't go there. But we don't understand the issue. We don't think there's anything that we can do. And so we feel awkward and we feel helpless. And so rather than engage in that awkwardness and that uncomfortableness, because we think we can't fix the problem, we do nothing. And so in my experience, that has tended to be the church's response to mental illness. Do nothing. Pretend like it doesn't exist, or that we could just pray it away. And it's when I heard Amy's story that I realized not only was I deeply convicted, but this is something that we need to talk about. This is something that we need to bring to light. Because as we've seen, this isn't an isolated issue or incident. But as we saw week 1, this is mainstream. And so we're in our final week of this short series, Mental Health, Who Knew? And so far, we've seen that we are in this together. Because we all live in a broken world, we all have broken parts of us. We're broken physically, we're broken mentally, which means, and we looked at this continuum of kind of the depression continuum, and we saw we are all on that continuum sometimes. That there are parts of us that are in disorder mentally, there are parts of us that are whole mentally, just as there are parts of us that are in disorder physically and in parts that are whole mentally. But we see that we're all in it together. All of us have broken parts. And last week we were reminded by Craig that Christ's intention in coming to the world wasn't just to give us eternal life after we die. But Christ came to the world so that we could have life and have it to the full today. Body, mind, and spirit. And Craig gave some great ideas on how to tap into that life to the full, and I hope you've been implementing some of those things in the last week as we bring all of our history to God, lay it at the foot of the cross, just tell him everything, and then we get up from our knees as though we believe that life to the full really exists. Well, today, we're going to conclude this short series by seeking to answer this question, what can I do? And really this is going to be a twofold question. I mean, when I am suffering mentally, what can I do for me? But more importantly, when those around me are hurting, what can I do to serve them? And what we're going to see is that whether I'm a trained counselor or I am just a person with a heart of compassion, all of us can do something. So, I want to take you to a very familiar story in the Bible, and we're going to look at it from a slightly different perspective in order to kind of unpack this idea and answer the question of what we can do, particularly for people struggling with mental disorders. And so, we're going to look at Luke chapter 10. If you have your Bibles, go ahead and open your Bibles to Luke chapter 10. But in Luke 10 is a story told of a young expert in the law who comes to Jesus and he asks him a question. And maybe you remember the question, but he said, "Teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" This guy is smart already, I think, in my book, because if you're going to ask God any one question, that's a good one, right? I mean, that's just getting right to the heart of the issue. What do I have to do to live forever? In other words, what makes God happy? What does God expect of me? What's important to him? And Jesus, in so many words, he turns to the guy and he says, "You're the expert in the law." And the law is basically the Old Testament, all the Old Testament. You're the expert in what God has revealed through Scripture. You tell me. What does God expect of us? And the guy comes out with this just brilliant answer. He says in Luke chapter 10, verse 27, he says, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." Pretty brilliant answer. And before you give him too much credit, he didn't think it up. He's actually quoting from the Old Testament books of Leviticus and Deuteronomy. But what an amazing summary of the Old Testament. What an amazing summary of our purpose and our mission as people to love God and love people. It all comes down to that one thing, love. Love God with everything that you are. And love your neighbor as you would want your neighbor to love you. Do for your neighbor as you would want your neighbor to do for you. And Jesus says to him, "You have answered correctly. Do this and you will live." The guy gets a pat on the back from Jesus. Way to go. Good answer. And this response of this attorney, this lawyer, gets at the very heart of who we are as a church. At Newday, we exist to develop passionate Christ followers who together love God and serve people. So we exist to love God and love people. That's it. That's why we exist. That's not only our purpose as a church, that's why you were created. If you want to know why do I exist? Why did God make me? Twofold purpose. Love God with all your heart. Love your neighbor as yourself. That's why you exist. And we have the kind of love God with all my heart thing. We kind of understand that. We could wrap our minds around it. We want to bring him all of our worship. Jesus said, if you love me, you'll do the things I ask you to do, so we obey him. Okay, we can get the whole loving God thing down, at least mentally. A little harder to implement, but we can understand it. But then when we get to loving our neighbor as ourselves, then questions start to come. Well, what does that really mean? Love my neighbor as myself. I mean, how far? I can go really far on this, Do I love everybody as I love myself? Do I have responsibility to every single person in the world who's hurting? I mean, where does this stop? And so questions come when we consider what it means to love my neighbor. And that's exactly what this young lawyer has on his mind. And so he asks Jesus this next question. And the Bible says that he was attempting to justify himself. So he wasn't wanting to fully love everybody, but he's wanting to know, okay, where's the line? I want to be able to justify myself to not love you and you and you and that person way over there and the person in Africa. So tell me, who is my neighbor? And that's the question he asks. Who is my neighbor? In other words, he's asking, who am I responsible to help? I can't help everyone. I can't meet every need. So tell me, Jesus, who do I have to help? Make it clear. And Jesus responds to the question, as he often does, with a story. He tells a story to answer the man's question of who is my neighbor. And what we're going to see is this is also going to answer our question, what can I do? Whether a physical or a mental issue, we're going to see that we could all do something. Jesus' story begins in verse 30. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he fell into the hands of robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. So a man is traveling this very dangerous road. It was known in Jesus' time to be a very dangerous road from Jerusalem to Jericho. And the guy gets jumped. Some bandits beat him, strip him, rob him, leave him for half dead. And there he lay, dying, most likely, needing help. Now, there are times when you get jumped or someone gets jumped and the injury isn't so serious that they're not able to help themselves. This guy could have gotten beaten less severely. Maybe he would have been able to pick himself up and dust himself off and stagger to the next town and get some help and recuperate on his own. And in the same way, there will be times when we can struggle mentally and still be able to help ourselves. So if you remember the continuum, there'll be times when we move into mild depression, perhaps. And there are things that we can do for ourselves to pick ourselves up and get ourselves back on the road toward life and peace and wholeness. And we've talked about some of those things, but I can go outside and get some sun. That's something I could do for myself. I could make sure I'm getting exercise to help myself, or I'm getting plenty of rest, or I'm eating right. Last week, Craig told us one of the best things to do when I'm suffering from mild depression is to engage with other people, to get outside of isolation, fight that urge to isolate myself, and interact with other people. Another great thing I could do for myself when I'm able to help myself is to be able to go out and serve someone else's needs. You focus on someone else's needs for a while, takes my mind off of my issues for a while, and gets me back on track toward mental health and wholeness. So there are times when we're suffering mentally, when we're able to pick ourselves up and get ourselves going in the right direction. But there may also be times when the hurt is so bad that there is nothing I can do for myself. Now, maybe not everyone will ever experience that or always experience that, but that is more common than perhaps we give it credit. There will be times when we need outside help. And this is the situation this man found himself in. There was nothing he could do to help himself. He was helpless. If he was going to get better, someone was going to have to come by and help him. Let's pick up the story in verse 31. A priest happened to be going down the same road. And when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So to a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. So along come a priest and a Levite, and if you're not familiar with those terms, those are the religious guys. And you would think that the man would be in luck because a priest and a Levite are coming down the road. These are the people we would expect would stop and help this guy who was beat up and dying. But before we give these guys too much of a hard time, they're in the waiting room of life, right? They're kind of like those people in the waiting room with Amy. And they see the issue and they agree to do nothing, or they decide to do nothing. And before we give them too much of a hard time, we have to realize they were justifying their actions internally. Right? They didn't walk by and say, well, I'm a bad person, and so I'm not going to help them. No, we don't do that. None of us do that. All of us are able to justify not helping other people. And these guys had great excuses. They could have justified it in any number of ways. Well, this is a really dangerous road, obviously, and if I stop and help this guy, I'm going to get beat up too, and then we'll have two beat up guys, and what good is that going to do anybody? Right? Or they could have said, hey, you know what? I'm not a doctor. I can't heal this guy. I can't really cure him. So why do anything? I have other things to do. I'm a priest. I need to be in the temple. Or they could have rationalized that I've got to get to the temple. I have more important things to do. I'm in a hurry. Or they could have said, you know what, the Old Testament law says if I touch this guy and he dies, I'm going to be unclean and unfit for service in the temple. I can't stop. And just as they could easily justify not helping that helpless man on the side of the road, it's easy for us to justify a lack of action in the lives of those suffering mentally. We tell ourselves things like, you know what, I'm no doctor. I'm no physician. I can't heal this person. Or I'm just really uncomfortable with those kinds of issues. Let someone else deal with it. Or, you know, I can't prescribe meds, or, you know, I don't want to make things worse. You know, I might say something that'll make things worse. Regardless of the excuse, we all have them. And we can all think of a reason to not get involved. But fortunately for this dying man, one more person comes down the road. Verse 33. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, took him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 silver coins and gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have. So Jesus puts a little bit of a twist on the story when he introduces the Samaritan. Because here is the one guy, the last guy you would expect to stop and do anything. And you may ask why. Well, why would a Samaritan stop and help a Jew when the Jews and Samaritans hated one another? Right? They were like bitter, mortal enemies. And so the Samaritan comes along, he sees this Jew dying. He could have thought of every excuse the priest and the Levite did and added a couple more. Right? Well, he's a Jew. I'm a Samaritan. He doesn't want me to touch him. He wouldn't stop and help me. He hates me. I hate him. I've got great reason to keep on going. But instead of making excuses, the Samaritan stops and he did what he could. So this is really the lesson here for us today. The Samaritan stopped, and he didn't do what he couldn't do, but he did what he could do. The Samaritan knew he wasn't a physician. He knew he probably couldn't cure the guy, right? He wouldn't apply the most up-to-date treatments to help the man. He wasn't a policeman. He wasn't going to be able to hunt down the robbers and bring them to justice. There was a lot of things he couldn't do. But he had a little oil and wine. And while it wouldn't cure the man, it would comfort him. And so he applied oil and wine to the wounds that the man had. And he had a donkey. So, well, the guy could ride my donkey for a while. I'll take him to a town. He was able to take him to a place where he was able to get more help. He didn't try to do it alone, but he used the help of others. And so through this story, Jesus is answering this question. Who's my neighbor? Who do I have responsibility to serve, to help when they're hurting? And he's telling us what our responsibility is to care for one another. Just as the story began with, who is my neighbor? Jesus ends the story with a question. So, who was the man's neighbor? And the expert in the law answered, the one who had mercy on him. And then Jesus ends the account by saying, go and do likewise. In other words, this is what God expects of you. This is what he wants from all of us. He expects to do the something that we can do. And it may not be everything the person needs. It may not solve the problem. It may not make everything right. It may not cure a person, but that doesn't mean we do nothing. We all have something to offer. And so the point is, you can do something. So when a person close to us is suffering from a mental disorder or a mental illness like depression or anxiety or whatever it is, and we ask ourselves the question, what can I do? What can I do? I hope we can see from the story of the Good Samaritan that you can do something. And again, you may not be a doctor or a counselor, or you may not have the ability to heal with a person or deal straight on with the issues or prescribe meds or do any of that kind of stuff. But you can care for a person. You can let them know they're not alone. The Good Samaritan used what he had, some oil, some wine, a donkey, connections. And what do you have to offer that might be able to minister to a person when they're in need? Any one of us can be a friend to somebody who's hurting. Any one of us can be present and listen. We can ask questions to draw a person out. You know, you seem to have been withdrawing recently. It seems that maybe you're depressed. Do you want to talk about it? Or once we know that somebody's struggling, ask them, hey, is today a good day or a bad day? How are you feeling today? And we could just listen. Not listening to fix, not listening to give advice, but just listen, to be present and let them know that they're not alone. Or more than that, more than just talking, we could also serve people's needs. We could offer to give someone a ride or take care of someone's kids or bring a meal or offer to go shopping or offer to come help and clean for an afternoon. We could take a meal. We could send a card. We can commit to pray. We could pray with somebody. You know, here's the thing. We wonder, what can I do to minister to or serve someone who is suffering mentally? What would you do to serve someone or minister to someone suffering physically? Whatever you do for them, do that for someone who's suffering mentally. So if you have a friend who has the flu, or is just going in for surgery, or is just getting out of surgery, what would you do for them? You're not the physician, you're not the doctor, you can't do the surgery, but there are still things that you can do that the doctor can't, right? We would go and visit. We would let them know we're praying for them. Maybe we'll send flowers to brighten their day. Maybe we'll send a note, hope you get well soon. Maybe we're going to go and pray with them. Maybe we're going to take their kids for an afternoon. Maybe we'll help them go grocery shopping. Maybe we'll take them a meal. What would you do for someone who is suffering physically? Now just take that and say, okay, I could do those same things for someone who is suffering with a mental disorder or illness. When they're in that place, I could do the same exact things to minister to them. I could bring them a card. I could send them flowers. I could let them know I'm praying for them. I could visit them. I could pray with them. I could take care of their kids. I could help them clean their house. And there will be times when you're ministering to someone when you're going to realize I'm over my head. Happens with me with physical issues as well. I'm like, wow, you need to get help. You are sick. You need to get help. You need to see a doctor. In the same way, there will be times when you're ministering to someone who's dealing with mental issues when you're going to need to say, you need to get help. In your own best interest, that we get you help, and you need to make a referral. I just want to make this as practical as possible as we kind of end this series. And so I'm going to ask our sister Darylyn to come up. And she's going to come up, and I know she's very nervous, as you would be too if you're coming up here. But we're going to just sit here together and have a bit of a discussion that I think might be a blessing to all of us. Dee, come on up. Thanks for being here. Have a seat.
Thank you.
I just want to affirm you for being willing to share a bit of your experience with us.
Sure.
I know this takes a lot of courage, and you're probably very nervous. A bunch of brothers and sisters here. We're in this together, right, guys? All right. Dee, I know that a couple of years ago you went through a very dark time emotionally. So can you just briefly describe what that was like for you?
Well, I've been depressed for about 16 years, been on and off antidepressants for that long, and seen several counselors. But recently, I fell into a deep depression and couldn't get myself out of it. I couldn't function normally. I couldn't take care of myself. But I just remember feeling so isolated, alone, and completely helpless.
Yeah. And I think a part of what was going on is when you're there, you isolate yourself a lot, but at the same time, there were some people around you who knew what was going on, a couple people, friends, and people from the church that you kind of confided in during that time. And during that time, they did some things for you that you appreciated, but maybe wasn't the most helpful thing. What were some of those things that maybe weren't the most helpful?
Giving advice. I know they meant well, and I appreciate it, but I was in such a dark place that advice didn't help.
Okay. So, like, just think positive thoughts, or...
Yeah.
Okay.
That's pretty much impossible.
All right. Okay. And I would certainly, I think it's good to make a differentiation that advice can help when people are mildly depressed.
Yeah.
You know, get outside or think positive thoughts or do this, do that. But when you're in a deep state of depression, I think it's probably impossible to think, just turn it on and start thinking positive
You
thoughts.
can't.
Yeah. What were some of the things that did work, that people around you were doing for you that let you know that you weren't alone?
Well, like you said in your sermon, I had a friend come over and take my kids for a while, and she made sure that I had meals. She had meals, people bring meals to me. And she actually took it on herself to get rid of all my extracurricular activities, my church activities, which at that time I just couldn't function in them at that time. But more importantly, prayer is what helped me the most. When I knew someone was praying for me or somebody was praying for me, that was the most important thing. It just made all the difference in the world.
Yeah. And you shared with me there were times when people would just pray with you, and every time that happened, you felt better afterwards.
Yes.
Wow. So there was one time when you found yourself in a kind of really scary situation. You found yourself somewhere, you didn't even know how you got there, and you didn't, that was really scary. You're like, what am I doing in this place? And at that time, a friend had been checking in on you regularly, and they just happened to call you at that moment. Tell me what they were able to do at that time to help you.
Well, she called me, which was out of the blue, and asked me how I was doing, and I had been sitting there wondering what I was doing there. I told her I was really scared and that I didn't know how I'd gotten there, and she immediately said, you need to go to the hospital. We're going to get you help. And she prayed with me, and she made sure I was safe. And that was the beam of light that I needed to get myself going, because I knew that I wasn't alone, and I knew that somebody knew how desperate the situation was. And that put me on the path to healing.
Yeah, that's great. So in a room with this many people, there's got to be some people that are hurting mentally. What advice would you give, or what counsel would you give to somebody who's like, I could relate to that story somewhat? What would you say?
Well, get help. If it's from your friends, your coworkers, your family, or a professional, just get help. Please don't do it on your own. It's almost impossible. But we are here for you. And just a second.
You got some good points there.
Well, and the final thing I would say about that is there's hope. There was a point in time where I didn't think there was any hope at all. I had totally given up, but I am in a much better place now.
So there's a time you didn't see yourself where you are now.
No.
Didn't think it was possible.
Didn't think it was possible.
Okay, well, for those of us who are kind of maybe connected with somebody who's suffering or hurting mentally, what advice then would you give out of your experience in terms of things that we could be doing to serve one another?
Pray.
Pray.
Pray with them. Pray for them. If you know somebody's going through that, keep them in your prayers every night, because it's so important. And be there. Listen. One of the most important things is to listen to them. Don't give advice. Just listen. We are like I said before, we are here for you. And if all else fails, get professional help.
Yeah, that's good. You said something yesterday that really intrigued me, but you said, don't let them push you away. What do you mean by that?
Because when you're in such a dark place like that, it's so easy. Oh, I don't need help. I'm okay by myself. Or it's hard to be social. It was very hard for me to come to church. It was very hard for me to talk to people, and I had people want to come help me, and I tried to push them away.
Yeah.
And that's...
You said don't
do
just
not
stay
push,
persistent.
Stay persistent. Don't let them push you away.
That didn't drive you crazy or anything if somebody was persistent?
I had persistent people.
Yeah, and you're okay with that?
Well, yeah.
Good. Again, I just want to thank you so much for being transparent with us today and sharing a part of your story. Let's hear it. The reason that we had this series is that we want to be able to care for one another and care for those who are hurting. And the church, listen, the church is critical in the care of people who are struggling mentally. A counselor may be able to do something once a week, maybe twice a week, but for someone to be able to return to vital living, they need to know that they're surrounded with unconditional love and acceptance by their Christian brothers and sisters. So the point of this series has been, first and foremost, to destigmatize this issue so that we can talk about it, so that we're comfortable to be able to talk about it and to be able to share when we are suffering mentally. Now, of course, that needs to be done in appropriate ways. That doesn't mean I come and every person I meet in the foyer, I tell them exactly what I'm going through. Okay, that's not appropriate. But I know who I can talk to, that I'm in relationship with people around me, someone in my small group, someone in my Sabbath morning class, someone on my serving team, that I'm in relationship with someone to be able to say, hey, I need to talk. I think, I might need some help, or I need to process some things. This needs to be a safe place to do that because we are a community of broken people, imperfect people who are in this together, okay? And the second reason for this series has been to encourage those who are struggling with mental issues to get help when you need help. We are a church that believes in Christian counseling. And I emphasize the qualifier Christian, that we believe in counselors who have a biblical Christian worldview and to be able to use biblical principles in order to bring us back to emotional health, as well as, at times, as we heard last week, medication. But you are a person made up of a body and a mind and a spirit. The three are interrelated. And just as there are times when you need to see a doctor for your body, there are going to be times when you need to see a doctor for your mind as well. Okay? One affects the other. And so don't be afraid to talk to someone. And finally, the reason for this series was that we can be empowered to know there are things that I can do when mental issues arise around me. That I don't have to be helpless. I don't have to feel awkward. And I may not be a professional counselor, but I can do something. You can do something. And in the waiting room of life, as people like Amy are struggling and looking around saying, would somebody help me? Someone to help, you can do something. You can provide care. You can provide hope. You can love your neighbor as you love yourself. And really, in the end, love may matter more than anything else.